The next chapter is called From Sinbad to Zheng. During this time period, which is the beginning of the medieval period, we start to see the emergence of Islam in India. So first, during the Umayyad Caliphate, during the expansion period, Sindh became part of the Caliphate. But thankfully, thanks to two Indian kingdoms, they weren't able to expand farther into India past Sindh. So they got up to Sindh, and then they sort of left, and they didn't really come back. In these two kingdoms that kept the Arabs from expanding into India were the Rashtrakulas and the Gujara Pratihara kingdoms. These two kingdoms were the ones who prevented the Arabs from coming in. And then the next period of sort of India's interaction with Islam was mostly characterized by trade. And this is when you start to see Islam entering Kerala through the trade routes. You start to see communities of Muslims coming from the Middle East into Kerala and establishing communities and eventually proselytizing. So there's a lot of this trade going between the Kerala coast and with the Middle East. And also, actually, it just so happens that during this time period, the swords that were being used by the Arabs, like for example during the Crusades, were made by steel that was produced with Indian metallurgy. So that famous Damascus steel is actually from India. So then comes the sort of bloody chapter of Indian history, which was the Turkic Invasions. So this began with Mahmud of Ghazni, who had raids going into Sindh and Punjab, and they were taking slaves back. And this was when the Gujara Pratihara kingdom was in decline. So Mahmud of Ghazni's sort of attacks on India were really motivated by plunder and by slave trade. So this was the time period. This is the time period where you start to see thousands of Indian slaves being sent out to Central Asia through these attacks. This is also the time period when the Chandelas of Bundelkhand construct Khajuraho. So the actual expansion of these empires into Delhi began with Muhammad Ghori, who took Delhi in 1192. Then you start to see a series of expansion sort of quests that expand to Varanasi and Kanauj. This is by 1194. During this time period is when Bakhtiyar Khilji takes over and destroys Nalanda and slaughters a bunch of the Buddhist monks that were living there. So then this time period was followed by a really sort of bloody conquest phase in Indian history, where you see like Qutbuddin Aibak comes in and establishes the Delhi Sultanate, during which you start to see the construction of the Qutb Minar. But he maintained the Pillar of Delhi, which was in the middle. During the later time periods, you even find that Ibn Battuta, who was a Moroccan historiographer, stayed with Muhammad bin Tughlaq and sort of wrote about that time period. And also after that, Delhi was sacked by Timurlane and started to go into decline. So one of the later kingdoms that he talks about is the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire starts with Babur, who only lived for about 5 years in India, and then he died. So then after that, Humayun, his son, takes over. But then Humayun is defeated by Sher Shah, and then comes back and reconquers Delhi. And so Humayun began Purana Killa, and then Sher Shah, his kingdom sort of finished it. And then Humayun came over. So Akbar, the next Mughal emperor, is the one who starts to establish the sort of Mughal kingdom. And actually his son, Jahangir, was very different than the rest of these Turkic invaders, because he added his inscription to the Ashokan pillar right after. So now the pillar goes Ashoka, Samudragupta, and now Jahangir. So this is the first Indian Muslim kingdom that is sort of claiming a relationship with the land. Another part of this chapter in Sanyal's book deals with Zheng, who was a Chinese naval officer, and he encouraged many Javanese people in Southeast Asia and Indonesia to convert to Islam. And the cool part about this is that you kind of realize that the Chinese were using Islam as like a political device to get rid of the Indian influence in the area. So the next chapter deals with the mapping of India. The mapping of India is... So before the British, really, there was no really good map of India. Many of the maps were intuitive, and the Arabs and Persians kept European geographers in the dark during this time. So the Europeans had their maps based off of Ptolemy's descriptions, which were outdated, and you can't really draw a good map from books. This sort of started to change when Vasco da Gama from Portugal did one exploration which led him to the coast of Kerala and in Calicut. The Portuguese then found out, once they figured out where Calicut was, they returned once again and then came back, and they forced the Samudran of Calicut. So this took the trade away from the Arabs and put it into the hands of the Portuguese, who brutally enforced control of this area. They would even set ships on fire that had passengers. They would set ships on fire that carried passengers to their pilgrimage, the Hajj. So maps of India during this early period really contained a limited knowledge of India's geography. And you can see as more areas are explored, you can see the maps becoming more detailed and more precise. And eventually, one guy by the name of Mercator, who was born in 1512, assembled all of this geographical knowledge into a single global map, which is still being used to this day. So during this time period also, during this 15th century, you start to see the sort of later period of this kingdom called Vijayanagara. After Alauddin Khilji broke down the sort of traditional system in the area, this was a sort of last-ditch effort to create, like, this was the last major Hindu empire, but it was later defeated by an alliance of all of these Deccani Muslim kingdoms, and you can actually read more of this in the book. It's a very great story. And also during this time period, you see the Dutch, they begin the East India Trading Company after they receive independence, and this private enterprise starts to develop better maps, which would be a good thing for libertarians to hear, right? The British also made their own East India Trading Company after this, and started a factory in Surat. So during the 17th, 16th, and 17th centuries, you start to see more travelers coming to India and writing about the different locations that they visit. And during this time period also, Aurangzeb imprisons his father Shah Jahan and takes over the Mughal Empire. His expansionist policies have a huge effect on the empire, but also his death begins the empire's decline. The Mughal Empire starts to decline after Aurangzeb. During Aurangzeb's time period, you start to see rebellions emerge in various parts of the empire. And after his death, it starts to sort of balkanize the kingdom. The period following, during the decline of the Mughals, you also start to see European maps beginning to improve. The British replaced the Dutch as the best map makers. The European maps were even better than the Maratha maps. The Maratha kingdom was another kingdom that emerged and expanded very rapidly. The maps of the Dutch were better than the maps of the Marathas because the Marathas maps were being used intuitively. They sort of assumed that you had some knowledge of the area, whereas for the Europeans, this was a totally alien destination for them. So their maps had to have more precision.